I would say in the past year and a half, I've become more concerned about China. I wrote an article, I think, for Project Syndicate, which is my main platform, in late December of 2022. I think it's called The Lament of a China Optimist. Beginning with the regulatory pressures that were put on the most dynamic piece of the private sector, the internet platform companies, in the summer of 2021. That development in the context of shifting the emphasis and focus of economic growth back to low productivity state-owned enterprises. Yeah. That got me very worried about the productivity piece of the economic argument going forward. And then the final shoe fell when the demographic population numbers were released in late 2022, early 2023, which said that the decline in the population for the overall Chinese society had begun and was occurring sooner than the demographers had expected. The way I do economics is when population declines and the workforce declines as the main piece of that population, the only way you can keep growing rapidly is to get higher productivity out of those who are still on the job. The productivity challenges in China, which are critical, are now getting attention in Beijing. A lot of the discussions that have been led by China's chief economist, a man by the name of Xi Jinping, have focused on so-called new factors of production with a clear aim to drawing conclusions for what we call total factor productivity, which is a concept that most people don't get and don't understand. How can you boost productivity if the role of low productivity state-owned enterprises is becoming more important? Yeah. If the role of high productivity private sector, new economy, internet platform companies is becoming less important, if their dynamism is being adversely affected by the tight regulatory constraints that have been put on these private sector dynamic companies in the last several years. There's one other piece that's left out of that list, and it's one that I've addressed for years in China, and that I noted again in my paper that I presented to this year's China Development Forum, as well as in the remarks I made the day after, and that's the need to rebalance the economy toward the Chinese household or consumer. You know, there's more talk about that, but it's unfortunately not talk that is being supported by aggressive new policies. Yeah. The point I've made on the Chinese consumer is because of aging, and because of the low level of security that is provided by the current social safety net, healthcare and retirement, that Chinese households are still predisposed toward fear-driven precautionary saving. The household savings rate is still in excess of 32% right now. And until the safety net issues get addressed, that savings rate is going to remain high, and Chinese consumers will be unwilling or unable to convert their role from savers to active discretionary consumers. The promises and security that a more robust safety net would offer are limited. And so the consumption share of the Chinese economy remains below 40% right now, which is extraordinarily low. I think Chinese policymakers and officials would benefit from learning what is it about the Western model of consumer-led growth that has created the dynamism of our economies, and what certain features of that model may be applicable to China in its own struggles to execute a very important rebalancing of its economic structure. I would say I've been sort of the first to make this point, and I've been consistent year and year and year in making this point to Chinese policymakers and to the China Development Forum. I remember saying this last year at the China Development Forum. I said, how many times do I have to keep coming back and making another presentation to you on consumer-led rebalancing and focusing on your social safety net? I said, I made that presentation probably 15 years in a row. You know, the safety net issues are typically among the most difficult, I think, for Chinese policymakers to grasp and change. In a consumer-led rebalancing model, China will shift from surplus saving to saving absorption. What do I mean by that? Putting its surplus to work in funding the social safety net, which it needs for consumer-led growth. A surge of consumer-led demand would, under normal circumstances, lead to increased imports from abroad that would bring its savings or trade surplus into better balance. Whether or not that would go from a trade surplus to a deficit depends on the extent of the consumer-led rebalancing and on the extent of Chinese tariffs to allow for the penetration of domestic consumer demand in China into foreign products. I want a better balance to the Chinese economy. Export-led growth was a powerful antidote to China when it was poor and when it was small. And it played a critical role in the 1980s in bringing the reforms and opening up of Deng Xiaoping to life. And when China got into the WTO in 2001, it had built the platform and the infrastructure to capitalize very powerfully on exports as an engine of economic dynamism in the early 2000s. There is growing concern right now in the West that if China tries to go back to that approach of export-led growth, given its scale, its size, then that will be met with an uproar and countered by a further protectionist tightening aimed at Chinese exports. If China goes back to the earlier model of export-led, industrial-driven growth, it faces the likelihood of an intensification of protectionist actions that I think would be very, very problematic. And that's why rebalancing in this climate is so vitally important for China. And it's a consumer-led rebalancing that China needs more than anything. You know, the point was made actually by former Premier Wen Jiabao, who said back in 2007 that the Chinese economy, while it appears to be strong on the surface, beneath the surface is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. The current structure of the Chinese economy back in 2007, and certainly still today, is an unsustainable recipe for future development and growth. And the government's been debating that off and on now for over 15 years. And so when the managing director of the IMF said at the China Development Forum, which I was at this week, she said it, I think, on Sunday, that China's at a fork in the road. Well, she's entirely right. But it's been at that fork since 2007 when Wen Jiabao raised the level of debate to focus on what was not sustainable about China. I certainly hope not, and I would say emphatically that China is not Japan. There are a number of critical characteristics of the Japanese experience, which, by the way, is not one lost decade, not two lost decades, but now 3 lost decades, that China needs to take very seriously. And the Chinese government knows this. In May of 2016, on the front page of People's Daily, the official newspaper of the state, there was an interview published by a so-called authoritative person that warned of the potential risks of the Japanization, if that's a word, of China. That triggered some significant debate in the high levels of the Chinese policy circles, gave rise to what the government called immediately, beginning in 2017, supply-side structural reform, focusing on productivity enhancement and eventually deleveraging in an overly levered property sector. China knows what it must do to avoid the pitfalls of Japan's lost decades. But again, I am struck by somebody who focuses on structural characteristics of both economies with 2 striking similarities between China and Japan. The demography of aging, where Japan's workforce is now weakening, and the stagnation of productivity, especially total factor productivity, that prevented Japan from offsetting the demographic headwind. Those are very worrisome similarities between China and Japan. You add to that the growing debt intensity of
it's 300% now.
The Chinese economy, which is a Japanese-style number, and it's a worrisome development that needs to be urgently addressed. Well, that was something that's featured in my latest book, Accidental Conflict, where I went through the origins and the changes over recent years in the U.S.-China conflict and reached the conclusion that we need more than diplomacy to solve this serious problem. It's great that, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden got together in Woodside, California last November. But, they'd last seen each other a year earlier in Bali in November of 2022. Then the surveillance balloon happened and everything went off the rails. Diplomacy is necessary but not sufficient for resolving a conflict between two powerful nations. And I fully support all the diplomatic efforts that are underway, and I draw some comfort that since the Woodside Summit, things seem to be stable. But the diplomatic efforts as they occur sporadically and infrequently. And so my idea for a U.S.-China Secretariat is to establish a permanent organization that operates 24/7, around the clock, located in a neutral venue, not in Washington, not in Beijing, but say Switzerland or Singapore if you want, I don't care, that has a broad remit to tackle and address all aspects of the relationship, from trade and economics to innovation and technology to subsidies of state sponsored enterprises and activities that occur both in the United States and in China, of course, to the big mega issues that have global import that both nations need to play a much more proactive role as leaders: climate change, global health, especially in the era of pandemics, cybersecurity, and even human rights. And the Secretariat would have the ability to analyze all of these problems, drawing on well-staffed technocrats, equal complements of Chinese and American professionals, working in a collaborative environment, going to work the same day in the same building 24/7. When disputes come up, as they inevitably will, the Secretariat would be empowered with a dispute resolution mechanism to address the inevitable frictions that occur. So I'm not saying that we should abandon diplomacy and go to this type of an organization. We need both. Diplomacy and the institutional connectivity that a Secretariat would provide on an ongoing basis. I believe strongly in that and have argued for that in print, in my book, in the article in The Wire, and on every occasion I get to be in front of senior officials in both nations. I have written a few articles that raise serious concerns about the future of Hong Kong, and those touch on some sensitivities in Beijing, and largely for that reason they asked me not to speak about that at the China Development Forum. I didn't mean that title to be an epitaph for Hong Kong. I meant it to be a wake-up call. There are a lot of people talking about it, especially in Hong Kong, and that's my intention. The Chinese officials that I was dealing with have made it pretty clear that they don't want to hear about problems. They want to hear more about a constructive view of China. And if you have problems, they would prefer that they not be raised in public. Common response that I've heard from so many is, we've heard this before. And Hong Kong is, if anything, a historically resilient place. There were riots in the late 60s. There was concern over the time of the handover. There was the Asian financial crisis. There was SARS. There was COVID. Hong Kong's always come back is the argument. And you, Steve Roach, are missing that inherent resilience in Hong Kong. And I'll tell you right now, I'm going to conclude that the case for resilience is a very weak one. That if China continues to grow slowly and even slow down further, that Hong Kong will do that as well. I think the risk of the Greater Bay Area is that Hong Kong gets marginalized as another large Chinese city rather than it gets injected by a new source of dynamism. I debated Laura Cha, the chair of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, over my views on Hong Kong and the factors that underpinned my view, including the prospects for the Chinese and global economy. I made 3 points in my Hong Kong argument that they were primarily economic, largely underscoring the linkage between the Hong Kong and the mainland economy, and secondly, raising concerns about the U.S.-China conflict having an adverse impact on Hong Kong trade, and then thirdly, the sensitive issue of political autonomy. That last Saturday, of course, is the day that the Article 23 national security law took effect. So I said all three of those really spelled trouble for Hong Kong in the years ahead, and Laura Cha agreed with 2 of my 3 points: the link to the Chinese economy, the adverse impact of the U.S.-China conflict, but she did not agree with my point on Hong Kong's political economy, or political autonomy, being compromised by either Beijing or its own soon-to-be implemented national security law under Article 23. I think very few people spoke directly to the Hong Kong issue. Most of the participants were aware of my views. There was very little pushback on the core argument, which is an economics argument as opposed to a political argument. Things got out of hand in 2019 with these mass demonstrations, and that was a political problem that was bordering on anarchy that had to be addressed. And so under a new security law, such as that which was just enacted, that provided the government with the mechanism to avoid a repetition of that. And whether or not that's appropriate, whether or not it goes too far, there's no question that it represents a new approach to dealing with political pressures should they arise in the future in Hong Kong, and that sort of casts a long shadow over the idea of political and policy autonomy that Hong Kong has long been able to command under, one country, 2 systems. I worry about Article 23 in the context of a brain drain of expats that's already going on, in the context of a U.S.-China conflict which is squeezing the engine of Hong Kong trade, with many international securities firms finding their ability to issue new public offerings sharply curtailed by developments inside of China, then they have reason to raise questions about the integrity of their business model going forward. Revenues are down for most of these China-dependent business platforms operating in Hong Kong, and in many cases they're down very sharply. If constructive criticism gets distorted into uncomfortable reactions by politicians or businessmen, they need to look at that themselves as well. And if they don't want me to come back to their country or their city or their economy because I've made them uncomfortable, I'm going to keep writing and speaking and talking to platforms like RFA in an effort to get the truth out. The debate is more important than the personal pressures that any one individual may feel in participating in that debate. So I go back to my early days in China, my first appearance at the China Development Forum. And it was at the second meeting in 2001, where I engaged in a debate that Premier Zhu Rongji wanted to hear. And we discussed that debate openly. And I would call on the current leadership of China and Hong Kong to do the very same. Discuss the debate on its merits, not on the basis of your personal political agendas.